Peter gets in here, and as he talks about what it looks like for a wife to submit to her husband, he does it in terms of 3 words. He does it in terms of her conduct, her priorities, and her resolve. Her conduct, her priorities, and her resolve. Let's look at her conduct. He says, be subject to your own husband, so that even if some of them do not obey a word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. So he describes his scenario. He says, listen, your husband doesn't believe you. He doesn't follow what you say. And in the middle of this, he fundamentally disagrees with you that Jesus is the way of salvation. He disagrees with you that there is a Yahweh God, that he created all things, that he desires for us to come to know him. And what it looks like in terms of you submitting to your husband and your conduct is not to browbeat him with your words. It's not just to go to him time and again. You wake him up in the morning and your husband rolls over, he looks at you and he just has this minty fresh breath that wafts over you, and you look at him and you say, are you still headed to hell? And he says, yeah, I guess so. I'm like, that's not the scenario that he creates. And he says, listen, this isn't even an everyday of presenting the gospel for him. This is communicating the gospel and then living out its implications. Your words will be emptied of their power if they're not followed by congruent actions. So when Peter is there and he's describing the situation and this early days of the church, the husband doesn't know much. He doesn't have the culture of what we have and an understanding of church. And so his wife says, listen, I can't follow your gods. I'm going to follow Jesus. He's the Messiah. He's the Savior. And she packs up and she heads to church and she comes home and she says, let me tell you about this Jesus. He's gentle. Let me tell you about this Jesus and what it looks like to love neighbors. Let me tell you about this Jesus and how to have conversation. Let me tell you about this Jesus and how to engage in grace and mercy and all these things. And let me tell you about this Jesus and how good, great, and wonderful it is. And the husband says, that's great. This Jesus sounds wonderful, but you're terrible. You're nothing like him. What he says the wife should do is engage in a way that models Jesus before her husband, so that he may be won without a word, without her running commentary about how great Jesus is, because he sees Jesus in her. And he describes her conduct as being respectful and pure. Now, the ESV softens this word respectful, and really it leads us to an understanding that maybe she's talking about, or maybe she's supposed to be respectful towards her husband. The word, though, is the same word we found back in chapter 2 in verse 17. It is the word fear. It is the word fear. Look back at chapter 2 and verse 17. He says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood. Everybody say, fear God. Fear God. She's meant to show her husband what it looks like for her to fear the Lord in their relationship. That he recognizes that she's not making decisions on him being happy or him being sad or the emperor doing this or the emperor doing that or warding off this superstition or that. She's making decisions from a place that she desires to honor the Lord in everything, and she's moving forward with her husband in reverential fear and awe of God. Further, she's engaging in pure conduct. She has taken it upon herself to live morally pure before the Lord. Now, some of that's going to put her in conflict with her husband. As he calls her to rituals, as he calls her to engage in things that are a violation of God's word, she's going to find herself moving in opposition to her husband. But her husband's observing these things, and he's asking the question in his mind, if not out loud, does she really act and believe all that she says is true? He is observing what she does. What does she need from us? One of the things that she needs from us is support. She is alone fighting a spiritual battle for the salvation of her husband. So what she needs from the Christian women in her life is support. She needs you not tearing down her husband and not talking about what a terrible person he is. She needs you coming alongside and encouraging her to continue to live out her faith in a vibrant, a beautiful, in a transforming way. She needs you to support her, and she needs you to pray for grace in her life. She needs you to be a support. She needs the positive role models within her marriage. She needs to see that within the confines of a Christian marriage that should have a leg up on this other display of marriage, she needs to see that these things can work out. She needs a vision of what to be called to. She needs something beautiful to give herself to the pursuit of. And she also needs, and you and I can take from example, she needs to see that this is a way Christians can be in relationships with folks with which they have disagreement. The broader understanding that when you engage with a lost person, you engage with a person who doesn't know the gospel, that you see that primarily as an opportunity to engage with them for their salvation, that you are contending for their salvation in your fear before the Lord and in your quiet and gentle engagement with them. She needs hope, and we need to join with her in that pursuit of giving her hope and giving her encouragement. The second way that she engages in submitting to her husband, we've talked about her conduct, and then we move to her priorities. We talk about her priorities. And so Peter casts this in terms of outward beauty and inward beauty. Outward beauty and inward beauty. There might be this temptation that she would face to adorn herself, to put makeup on, to adorn herself with clothes and jewelry and all these things to entice her husband to see the beauty in her and come to understand that somehow the gospel is doing that. So he says, listen, don't focus primarily on the external. Don't focus primarily on the external. Peter also doesn't go in and say, listen, you can't ever wear a lick of makeup and you can't ever wear any jewelry. That's a whole separate issue. But what he talks about in there is, listen, don't let your focus be on the external. Those are things in some sense that are easy to do. Verse 4, but let your adorning be dressed in the hidden person of the heart. He says it is with imperishable beauty and a quiet spirit. Matthew 11, Jesus describing himself, bid those come to him, and he said, I am gentle and lowly. What the wife is meant to be seen and engaging in is the same gentleness of following Jesus. That the husband will be won over as he sees her time and again face hardship, face difficulties, and give herself to this quiet persistence of loving her husband well and loving and submitting to God in all things. How helpful is that same pattern to follow for so many of us in the various relationships that we have at work, in the marketplace, with our extended families. These aren't people we're necessarily married to, but we can follow this example of glorifying God in our conduct as we are surrounded by people who look at Christianity and say, this is the biggest farce, this is the biggest heap of mess that I've ever experienced, and it has no substance. The quiet, determined disposition of this one who would give themselves to submitting to their husbands in an effort to glorify God and win their salvation. He says, God looks at this lastly, and he says, God says, this is very precious. Maybe this is your experience. Maybe this is where you are and you're wondering. You don't see your husband moving to the faith. You don't see the way that you seek to be faithful to Jesus making an impact on him. So you begin to ask the question, is it even worth it? Is it even worth it? My prayer for you is that you would take solace, you would feel some sense of comfort in the delight of God who looks at you, who looks at your sacrifice, he looks at your pain, he looks at your difficulties, and he believes you to be precious. He believes your worth to be of inexhaustible riches. He loves you and he cares for you. And he's given his Spirit to you to be an encourager in this difficult circumstance and in this difficult union. So we've seen her conduct and her priorities. Lastly, look at her resolve in verses 5 and 6. He says, listen, I know this is difficult, but here, let's take a lesson from the past. He says, this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Notice first, he says, this is how those women who hoped in God. Their hope cannot be in the transformative power of their behavior, because they're going to see their husband, who really is caught in a spiritual struggle. They're going to see him be kinder. They're going to see him be warmer to the gospel and more receptive to it. And they're going to see him grow in hardness of heart. And if their encouragement, if how they feel in any given moment, I feel good or I feel bad, is determined by his receptivity to the gospel, then it's going to go like this. It's going to go up and down. So what he calls them, what he calls us, what he calls you, in so much as you find yourself there, is to put your hope in God. You remember the passage we talked about Jesus last week. He talks about him being reviled and him suffering, but he didn't revile, he didn't threaten in return, but he continued entrusting himself to God who judges justly. It's the same call for the wife in this position. What would it look like you to grow in your trust of the Lord? What would it look like for you to have a conversation with someone around you and to share with them candidly, I feel hopeless and it feels ineffective and unimpactful to engage in the lip service of trusting to the Lord? Would you pray with me for this? Would you talk with me and have conversation with me about this hardship and this difficulty? What God calls us to do is to place our hope in him, not in our ability to orchestrate and to change our circumstances. So he says, lastly, he says, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you're her children if you do what is good and don't fear anything that is frightening. In chapter 12 in Genesis introduces us to a man named Abram and his wife Sarai. And God tells him that he's going to make him a great nation. So that you got this older couple with no kids. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a great nation. In you will all the peoples of the earth be blessed. He raises him up and he sends him out. And we see all the nation of Israel ultimately come from the union of Abram and Sarai. Now, God changes their names to Abraham and Sarah. But when they're in their 9th decade of life, God shows up and he says, listen, I promise this to you. And this time next year, I'm going to come back and Sarah's going to be with child. And Abraham begins to stifle a laugh. And Sarah just gives herself to a full belly laugh. She chortles, probably. Something like that. But when she recognizes that when she did it, God is not... he's not hard of hearing, so the angel of the Lord hears. He's like, you laugh. She's like, no, me? It's this weird sneeze thing I do. Excuse me. And so in the middle of this and in this possible scenario where they look at themselves and they say, we're basically crypt keepers. Like, ain't no way we're having kids. She refers to Abraham in the middle of that as Lord. So even in the middle of this laughable scenario, she looks at him and she respects him to the degree that she's able to refer to him as Lord. And that's the faithfulness that God calls us to. Now we look at this situation and the ESV renders this really oddly. It says, don't fear anything that is frightening. I tend to only be afraid of things that are frightening and some things that aren't. I startle easily. Don't ever touch me in the dark. But I want you to put yourself in her situation for a second. First century, she really has no rights. She's not highly regarded. She's really kind of comes up underneath her husband. Her job is to make him look good, to help him grow in society. She is a person of utility. She serves a role. To submit herself to God, to submit herself to the Lord, is going to bring her into opposition with her husband. She's got to tell him, I can't worship your gods. She's got to tell him, I can't engage in some of the behaviors that we did before. And in that, she faces ostracism from her husband and her husband's family. She faces the possibility of being cast out and having no ability to provide for herself. So her whole life is hanging in the balance, and her whole life is an experience of fear. She's not making a mountain out of a molehill. Everything in her life is tenuous and is truly terrifying. What God calls her to do is to live in the persisting trust of the one who holds her life in the balance. He says, don't give way to fear, because if fear champions the day and it wins, what we're going to find is that time and again, she will leave the convictions of her heart to pursue the ease of following the path of her husband. Don't give yourself